And when I woke up that morning after the lucid dream, I woke up to a new day, but I also woke up to a completely new reality. And this was a deeply felt, deeply lived and noetic experience of spirituality. I woke up and I opened my eyes, and as I scanned around the room, there was a deep, lifelike quality to everything around me. All the objects, inanimate objects, including the four walls around me, the ceiling above my head, the sheets on my bed, everything was breathing this new life energy. And it was as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and I could finally see what was already there before the experience, but that I had been blinded to my whole life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Spiritual Awakenings International Presents. I'm Dr. Yvonne Kason, the president of Spiritual Awakenings International. Spiritual Awakenings International is truly an international network. We are delighted to have subscribers from 75 countries around the world. Why don't you all take a moment now and please type into the chat where it is that you're joining us from today. We love to hear where you're joining us from. I'm joining you from Toronto, Canada, and our speaker today is joining us from London in the UK. And others here are in the West Coast of the United States. So hello, everyone, from wherever you're from. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our featured speaker for today, Jessica Corneille. She is a London, UK-based research psychologist who specializes in spontaneous spiritual awakenings. She has a master's degree in psychology with distinction from the University of Greenwich, where she focused her studies on exceptional human experiences, which we know as spiritually transformative experiences. Her passion is to bridge the worlds of science and spirituality, and to encourage mainstream psychology to encompass the transpersonal or spiritual. Jessica is also dedicated to helping individuals realize their highest human potential, and does this as a Kundalini yoga teacher and a leadership and empowerment coach. Jessica works for the Scientific and Medical Network, which is a Spiritual Awakenings International affiliated group, and is a member of the Galileo Commission's Steering Committee. She's also a collaborator of the Emergent Phenomenon Research Consortium and the Spiritual Crisis Network. So with no further ado, I welcome Jessica Corneille.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Yvonne, and everybody else for having me on your show this evening on your YouTube live. It's a real honor to be here with you all this evening. I'm sure many of you have experienced spiritually transformative experience. You probably know something about spontaneous spiritual awakenings, but I'll be guiding you through what I've learned on my journey through my personal and also my scientific journey through spiritual awakenings of a spontaneous kind. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and get going. So what are spontaneous spiritual awakenings? The way I define them is that they're subjective experiences characterized by a sudden and overwhelming sense of connection, communion, or contact, or complete non-dual merging or experience of oneness with a perceived ultimate reality, the universe, universal consciousness, or the divine. And why am I so interested in this phenomena? Well, I myself have had an experience of the type about 6 years ago. Now, I'll give you a little bit of context of what was going on in my life at that time. So I was an avid rejecter of anything pertaining to the spiritual or the religious. I didn't understand it, I didn't know what it was, and I didn't believe in it, to be honest. And I had just moved countries. I moved to Madrid, started a new job just after university, and was living in a very exciting period of my life. I was making new friends and going out lots and just enjoying myself a ton. And like I said, I didn't know anything about, spiritual religious concepts. And yet one night when I went to bed, I fell asleep and I wasn't under any type of intoxicants. I hadn't had any alcohol or anything like that before going to bed. And I fell asleep and I was propelled into the most intense lucid dream that I had ever experienced in my life. I had experienced lucid dreams prior to that night, but nothing could compare to what I experienced during that lucid dream. And what happened is that I was in this kind of space where I was moving about and conversing with what I knew to be deep thinkers, so mathematicians, philosophers, psychologists, philosophers, and so on and so forth. So I knew intuitively that these people were great thinkers. And I was asking each and every one of them the same question. I was asking them, what is the meaning of life? And every character gave me a very different, yet very elaborate answer to my question. And there came a point in this very long, very drawn out, and very lucid dream where I came to realize, oh my gosh, the answers are already within me. I mean, whether they come from something beyond me or whether they come from inside my mind, and this is just a reflection of what is already within my psyche, the answers are already within me because I'm receiving them. And when I woke up that morning after the lucid dream, I woke up to a new day, but I also woke up to a completely new reality. And this was a deeply felt, deeply lived and noetic experience of spirituality. I woke up and I opened my eyes, and as I scanned around the room, there was a deep, lifelike quality to everything around me. All the objects, inanimate objects, including the four walls around me, the ceiling above my head, the sheets on my bed, everything was breathing this new life energy. And it was as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes and I could finally see what was already there before the experience, but that I had been blinded to my whole life. And I realized intuitively and instinctively that this was a spiritual awakening, an enlightenment experience or a non-dual experience, as I felt connected to everything and everyone in the entire universe. So I felt this deep sense, a very physical sense as well, vibrational sense of being connected to everything, a deep sense of oneness. And I was flooded with this immense sense of love that I'd never experienced before. And bearing in mind, I wasn't raised under any sort of terrible circumstance. I was always, flooded with love, let's say, in life by my parents and by my friends, very luckily. And yet, so love wasn't something that was alien to me. And yet this sense of love was just beyond any of that. And yet encompassed that kind of love too. And there were many different features to my experience, and my experience lasted for many months. But on that specific day, I was, like I said, overwhelmed by this deep sense of love and this deep feeling of gratitude. And I knelt down on my bed and I cried for what feels like it could have been hours, but it was probably minutes, because time and space just ceased to exist in that moment. And I felt a deep sense of reverence, a deep sense of being reborn, and a deep sense of mission and of selfless service. And all of these things came out of that one moment, that one singular moment of waking up that morning. And the colors around me, the sounds, everything, all my perception was enhanced. So my five senses were enhanced. But very interesting things happened as well beyond what we could describe as my five senses, in that I started to experience very strong synchronicities. So I'll give you an example. That same day, I had a meeting with a woman. I won't say who it is, but she's a princess from the Middle East. And we were meant to meet and have coffee. And as I met her, and it was the first time that I'd met her, and she didn't know anything about me, and bearing in mind my experience had occurred that same morning, and I didn't post about it anywhere. That moment when I met her, she looked at me and she knew that I had experienced this spontaneous spiritual awakening, because she said, I know what you're going through. I've had the exact same experience. And it was, I mean, it was so life affirming, but also a little bit freaky. You know, all of these things started happening that I couldn't describe. And yeah, I was left with this deep sense of awe and reverence and heightened perception for many months after that experience. So I was in an altered state for many months. And as my experience began to integrate into my everyday experience of life, it just started to become more and more a part of me, let's say. I started to want to investigate a little bit more what this experience was, what had happened to me from a more scientific perspective. Not that I needed that kind of validation, because I knew intuitively what had happened to me, and I didn't feel that I needed to even tell people because I didn't need any sort of affirmation. But I was curious, and I went online and I couldn't find anything about my experience, really. Or it was kind of hidden. I had to go searching for it in the deep depths of the internet. So it was very hard for me to gain access to what had happened to me from a more scientific perspective. And I started to wonder, why is this? You know, is this a big secret that we're not talking about? Why are we not being taught this at school, for example? Why wasn't I aware of the possibility of the human potential that I carried within me my whole life and that I had been exposed to very randomly? And then I started reading up a little bit more about, indigenous perspectives, traditional yoga perspectives, Tantra. And I kept finding myself resonating more with those texts than with anything that had been written by sort of Western authors. But then I started finding out about Alan Watts, Aldous Huxley after his psilocybin trip, and started informing myself and reading up about those, my experience, but through the eyes of other people. But I still had this sense that I needed to connect with a community of some sort. And I got in touch with an organization called ASSIST, the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. I got in touch with them and I explained that I was just craving some sort of validation, actually. At this point, after many months, I felt that I did actually need that community feeling. And I wanted to speak with someone else who had experienced something similar to me. And they immediately got back to me and referred me to an online Facebook group, of all things. And I got in touch with them. They're called Shades of Awakening. And I found an immense community of people who had the similar types of experiences to mine, to some degree or to another. And I also realized in those moments that, wow, okay, not all experiences are identical to mine. They're not all blissful and beautiful. They can also be deeply traumatic and deeply difficult and deeply challenging for individuals. And a lot of these people were coming out saying that they didn't know who to speak to. They were having these very difficult experiences and they didn't know who to turn to, or that they had been medicalized for having had those experiences. And we'll come on to the problems around this a little later on, but I'm sure you're all already aware of why it is important for us to have a more soft approach when it comes to people having going through extreme psycho-spiritual states. But I realized that I needed to gain the tools in order to change things from the inside. I know I'm not the only one, but I knew this was a deep sense of mission, and it was I had a real sense that this was something that I needed to do. So I went back to university. I quit my job in Spain, went back to university to study psychology so that I could then write papers and inform mainstream psychiatric systems of these experiences by raising awareness and by communicating what best to perhaps consider doing when someone is having a blissful but also difficult spiritual experience. So here's what I learned on my journey. Sorry, I missed these slides. What do we know so far about spontaneous spiritual awakenings? So we know that their main characteristics are those of a sense of connection, oneness, deep sense of bliss, of peace, of love, and that they're also noetic, so they're deeply embodied, they're deeply felt. Many people, including myself, refer to them as cellular or vibrational. They're also ineffable. They have this ineffable quality, and that it's very difficult to explain these experiences with words. And they often feel realer than real to individuals. But then there are other common features, including cognitive behavioral features and changes such as increased gratitude, increased curiosity and creativity, increased sensitivity. So as I already mentioned with my own experience, I felt that the colors and the shines were really, really enhanced. Anything that would touch my skin just had this incredible heightened sensation. And then the altered time and space perception is a very common feature of spontaneous spiritual awakenings. And then these experiences can also be accompanied by deeply physical experiences. So I, for instance, had a very strong sense of light and tingling, well, tingling and light emanating from my heart center, my third eye point, and the crown of my head. And bearing in mind, I didn't know anything about yoga or about the chakra systems or energy points in the body. So it's very interesting that I should have felt that way. So deep sense of luminosity, heat, tingling, prickling, or electricity in the body is very common, especially in the extremities of the bodies, for example, in the hands and in the feet, in the crown of the head. Some people might experience disruptions to the reproductive system. Some people might experience spontaneous orgasms, for example, or might have spontaneous purges, so disruptions to the digestive system as well, quite common. And then in some cases, you have people who report involuntary positionings of the hands, so in what are known as mudras in yogic terms, so different hand postures or physical postures. And then the experience might move on to something a little more what we might define as paranormal. So extrasensory perception might take place. People might experience synchronicities, archetypal visions. So there might be a sense of meaning, heightened sense of meaning regarding everything, heightened sense of being able to connect the dots or connect different things with each other, creating patterns. Telepathy might be enhanced. Some people might feel spiritual presences around or might hear things that are not necessarily heard by other people. And of course, some of these characteristics might actually be deeply challenging for individuals, and this might cause spiritual emergency or spiritual crises. These are what we refer to as negative or negatively perceived spiritual experiences, including negatively perceived spiritual awakening experiences. And these experiences are, they might occur through no apparent trigger, or they might be preceded by a number of different preceding factors, such as spiritual contemplative practices, i.e. yoga, meditation, mindfulness-based interventions, sacred sexual intimacy or celibacy, so the manipulation of the ojas in the body or of libido energy. Past use of psychedelics seems to be something that we've noticed a connection with people who report spontaneous awakening experiences. Homeostatic imbalance, so through sleep deprivation, for example, or through fasting, or through really, really intense exercise, physical exercise. And then contact with nature was a very commonly reported preceding factor to the experience. But the most commonly reported factor, which I found very, very interesting, is a prolonged period of psychological turmoil or trauma. And this was something that we found in our own paper, and mine and David Luke's paper, but also in various other papers that I'd read on spiritual awakenings, not necessarily of a spontaneous nature. So we can see from these preceding factors, and also by the fact that they might occur through no apparent trigger, that these experiences are not necessarily mediated by one's spiritual or religious context, and as is evidenced by my own experience as well. And then whether the experience lasts, or the peak of the experience, i.e. the altered state lasts for minutes or hours, it almost always has deep and long-lasting effects to the experiencer. And this really includes an increased physical sense of physical and mental well-being. So people might just, things like chronic pain in the body might disappear after an experience like this. These experiences are also associated with increased pro-social behaviors. So people might sense a real feeling of empathy for individuals, deep sense of gratitude, a sense of wanting to help others. Altruism is increased following these experiences, and of pro-environmental and nature connectedness behaviors. So people might sense a real need to connect with nature, and also they might change their eating habits. So many people become vegan or vegetarian after their experience. And then there's usually a liberation from past attitudes and beliefs. So it's like a rewriting of everything. The way I like to describe it is that there's almost an obliteration of all prior life experiences or filters that we create over our life. And it's almost like we're accessing an objective reality. And with that comes a liberation of what we were shackled to in our past. And this often moves people away from a sense of religion or religiousness and onto different philosophical views. And there's also a tendency to move away from materialistic lifestyles. And of course, there's a higher sense of purpose and meaning tends to follow these experiences, and a sense of mission and selfless service. And this might just create changes in career paths and in relationships. And yeah, so in increased interest in spiritual-based lifestyles might actually occur after the experience as well. And this might improve positive identity and coping and other beautiful things. And this creates a lovely upward spiral, which then ends up decreasing a tendency for psychopathology. And we can actually see this this is an example from my own paper, where we see the regularly practiced activities before and after the experience. And I don't know if you can see the changes in percentages here, but anyway, there seems to be an increase in all of those very holistic and very pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors following a spontaneous spiritual awakening. But so we've observed the fact that mystical experiences are associated with positive subjective effects, but they're also measured, they're also associated with positive objective effects, as we can notice from a decreased tendency of committing suicide amongst suicidal individuals, the treatment of treatment-resistant tobacco and alcohol addiction, and there seems to be a 3- to 4-fold increase in abstinence in addiction post spiritual awakening, not necessarily spontaneous. And the very basis of the 12-step program, or Alcoholics Anonymous, is spiritual attainment or spiritual awakening, as they actually mention it. And even Jung proposed spiritual awakening as a means of getting over substance abuse, which is really interesting. And psychedelic research is now also pointing the finger at mystical experiences as mediators for more sustained treatment of treatment-resistant addiction, depression, and reductions of anxiety, hopelessness, and fear of death in patients with palliative care, for instance. So, in other words, it's not only the psychedelic that seems to be mediating the changes, but it's the degree of mysticism or mystical experience, including what we know as spiritual awakenings, that mediates the more sustained and more profound changes in these ailments. And even yoga and meditation and mindfulness-based interventions are used to treat. So just to mention that these practices, if you don't already know, have a tendency to induce things like spiritual awakenings, and they are being used as standard psychotherapy in the National Health Service in the UK at the moment to treat things like stress and anxiety, substance abuse, general mood disorders, psychiatric disorders, and physical ailments such as chronic pain as well. So we're seeing this pattern emerging through research, and they're looking into these kinds of practices, so yoga, meditation, and mindfulness-based interventions, but also psychedelics. And they're observing similar patterns for healing. And yeah, so this all points the finger to mystical experiences being excellent mediators for sustained change. In terms of popular theories and postulations around why a spontaneous spiritual awakening might occur, we don't really know the reasons why they might occur, but let's have a look at a couple of suggested reasons. So psychedelic research has pointed to the default lowering in the default mode network as potentially mediating spiritual awakenings in individuals. And so this might be applicable, the lowering of the default mode network might actually be applicable to individuals who experience spiritual awakenings in a spontaneous way. And what does the default mode network do? It's a network of brain regions associated with our typical sense of self. So in other words, our association with our egoic self. And when people take psychedelics, or when they indulge in contemplative practices such as yoga and meditation, there seems to be a reduction in activity in the default mode network. In other words, our egoic sense of self seems to be reduced, and we're able to measure this through brain scans. And there seems to be an increase in neurological connections across the entire brain. And this might be what's responsible for an increase in creativity and in deep changes to personality following a psychedelic trip. And like I said, this might be applicable to spontaneous experiences as well. And then there's the endogenous DMT theory postulated by Rick Strassman. So yeah, it's all about what he's sort of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is a substance that is endogenous to human beings, and it exists in us. It's in our blood, we can measure it. But there is a postulation that it might increase, or it might increase at the time of birth and at the time of death. And since mystical experiences such as spiritual awakenings are deeply linked, or they're very similar to certain near-death experiences, for example, there is a postulation around whether spontaneous spiritual awakenings might actually be due to a release of endogenous DMT in the body, or a heightened concentration of DMT in the blood. In my own research, where we asked individuals, have you ever had a strong experience of a profound spiritual nature in which you suddenly and non-intentionally felt in contact, communion with something that is considered to be an ultimate reality, God or the divine? Have you ever felt that your ego suddenly transcended beyond an ordinary personal identity in space, and that you became one with the universe? We received the responses by 152 participants aged between 18 and 69 years old. We wanted to understand whether individuals felt that this experience was predominantly positive or negative. And we realized that, as we hypothesized, the experience was predominantly overall positively perceived in both short and long terms. But as you can see here, there is a difference in percentages between the short-term positively perceived responses and the long-term positively perceived responses. So this kind of indicates that even when an initial experience is difficult, it almost always seems to have a positive long-term effect on the individual. But what is really needed, and what the idea behind the paper was to sort of put forward this idea that we need to be able to treat individuals in an appropriate way in order to up those numbers and make sure that their experience is appropriately validated, so that they're able to integrate their experience and have an overall positive experience. We also found in our research that temporal lobe lobidity, which is indicative of epileptiform disturbances in the temporal lobes, which in themselves are associated with language and emotion and visual memory, among other things. That there was that temporal lobe lability, so these symptoms were good predictors of spontaneous spiritual awakenings. In other words, the stronger the spiritual awakening in our research, in our participants, the stronger the reported spiritual awakening experience, the stronger the temporal lobe lability results were. So there seems to be a correlation between these two. And trait absorption, which is measures the depth to which one's attentional involvement occurs in relation to internal or external stimuli without effort or control, or in other words, the level of engrossment that one might experience, is also positively associated with spontaneous spiritual awakenings and is a predictor of spontaneous spiritual awakenings in our paper, in our research project. So in other words, again, the stronger the reported trait absorption levels, the stronger the spontaneous spiritual awakening outcome. We also wanted to understand how spontaneous spiritual awakenings related to other altered states of consciousness. So we mapped these, and I'm not going to show you all of the mappings because there are quite a few, but we mapped them again. We mapped spontaneous spiritual awakenings against drug-induced and non-drug-induced altered states of consciousness. And what we found is that compared to all altered states, including the drug-induced, spontaneous spiritual awakenings seem to be overall deeper in depth of experience, so stronger experiences, and compared to all measured drug and non-drug induced altered states, and that they were most similar in phenomenology, i.e. in the characteristics, and in the depth of experience to strong doses of psilocybin and DMT. Again, DMT is dimethyltryptamine, and psilocybin is the active ingredient in things like magic mushrooms, the psychedelic drugs. And just to give you, just by means of comparison, these are spontaneous spiritual awakenings in orange, again, compared to all non-drug induced altered states of consciousness. So why is it so important for us to move towards a more rounded understanding of such experiences? There are many reasons, but the main one, in my opinion, is for support and integration. So as we've already seen, spontaneous spiritual awakenings can be deeply challenging, and these can be challenging either in the initial experience. So as the individual has the experience, they might be bewildered, confused, shocked by what they're experiencing, by the fact that their brain is operating in a completely different way. Maybe they're having extrasensory perception that they don't want or they don't know how to use or experience. And that can be deeply bewildering for individuals. But spiritual awakenings can also be difficult during the integration phase as one tries to make sense of their experience. So like me, the experience can be really blissful initially. And then when you start to dig deeper into why it is that you have that experience, it might be shocking to not find yourself reflected in any of the stories that you find online, for example, or it might be difficult to relate to individuals. And since the very nature of spontaneous spiritual awakenings are that they're sudden and that they possibly occur outside of a spiritual context, in my opinion, this makes the likelihood of a more difficult spiritual awakening experience even more likely, since one might not have the appropriate community to talk to about these experiences, might not get the right validation. And whilst these experiences are paralleled in mainstream psychiatry and psychology with mental or physical health disorders, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other psychiatric conditions, and the overlaps might be evident, but I really do believe that these experiences exist as experiences in their own right that deserve their own research and their own investigation. So, like I said, they might be interlinked in some cases, but I do believe that they are essentially two separate experiences that can be had in conjunction with one another. And we have actually seen in more recent research that's coming out that spiritual awakenings seem to diverge or differ significantly from things like psychosis in alogia, which is poverty of speech, depression, anxiety, and stress. So there are a number of different studies right now that are coming forward and saying, hey, let's not converge both experiences into one. Let's try and pick them apart to try and understand their characteristics, to try and understand how to best support individuals who are undergoing spiritual awakenings and those who are undergoing difficult psychotic experiences that might have elements of spiritual awakenings within them. And because of the stigma that is exuded by the medical system at the moment, unfortunately, individuals might be really reluctant to tell their mental health professional what they're going through, even if they're having a very difficult experience, or even if they're having a positive experience that they need a bit of guidance towards or for. They might actually hold their experience back, keep it within them, and maybe even bury it within their psyche for fear of being judged. And many people don't report their experiences to their family members either for the same fear, because they're very deeply misunderstood in the West, particularly. And despite best efforts on behalf of transpersonal psychologists to integrate a new chapter in the diagnostic manual back in 1994, they were able to do so in order for psychiatrists and psychologists to have a better understanding of these experiences and how to treat them. The experience is almost always referred to as a psychiatric problem rather than an experience that carries with it deep healing and transformative potential if held appropriately. And on top of that, the chapter itself is quite incomplete because it only really adheres to individuals, or only really helps individuals who are having those experiences within a specific tradition or religious context. So it's kind of brushing aside experiences of a more spontaneous nature that might be held outside of a religious or spiritual context. And I believe that this lack of use of this diagnostic category or chapter is due to a lack of spiritually informed clinicians, and also due to a limited Western-centric psychological interpretation of what it means to be a human, what normality means, and so on. And I think there's a real need to return to indigenous ways of knowing, as well as moving forward in psychiatric and psychological research. And the improper treatment, of course, of individuals having spiritual awakenings on one side of the spectrum, so perhaps void of psychiatric disorders, and people who are having spiritual awakenings, but in conjunction with the psychiatric disorders, will result in trauma. And so we really need to be careful with how we handle individuals. And having said that, there's also a necessity, in my opinion, to reframe mental health disorders as potential catalysts for deep transformation and change. And there's a beautiful quote by Joseph Campbell that I'd like to cite. And it is that the psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims in delight. I'm sure you've probably all heard that one before, but it's one that I like to bring out in my talks. And we see, people often think that these experiences are rather exclusive, that they're not experienced by a majority of people. And indeed, I think they are pretty rare, particularly those of a spontaneous nature and not induced by things like psychedelic drugs. But it appears that these experiences are perhaps a little more frequent than we think, than we tend to think within the mainstream. And this is kind of evidenced a little bit by a Gallup study, so a survey that was put out to 1,509 participants in the US back in 2002, where 41% of all individuals, and this projects to 80 million American adults, fully identified with the statement, "I have had a profound religious experience or awakening that changed the direction of my life." That is significant, 41%. Again, this is just a little indication, but it's an indication nonetheless. And of course, with the increase in research on psychedelic drugs, on contemplative experiences, and the increase of practice of yoga, meditation, and mindfulness, with an estimated 200 to 500 million people engaging in some form of regular meditation worldwide, I think that these experiences will continue to occur with more frequency in the future. So we really need to find a way to deal with them in a better way. So what needs to change? Well, people need to have better access to peer support and validation, better access to open access information. And I'm referring specifically to scientific papers, because a lot of them are behind paywalls and non-accessible to individuals. People should have access to spiritually informed clinicians, i.e. clinicians, therapists, psychiatrists who haven't necessarily had a spiritual awakening experience, but who know of their existence and who know of the best way to carry and guide people through their experiences in a non-judgmental and therapeutic way. Now, how can we change things? I believe that research is the way forward, because research sparks academic interest and it leads us on an exponential growth in academic research on these kinds of experiences. And we're already seeing things shift. Even in the last 6 years since I had my experience, I've noticed a ton more research on spiritual awakening experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences. But yes, we need to continue working on this and keeping them as open access papers. And this chat will obviously inevitably challenge the default pathologization of spontaneous spiritual awakenings as well, since people will realize that they're not always negative and that they don't always carry the same characteristics as mental health disorders. Research will also help inform clinicians on the best possible ways to guide people through their experiences, and ultimately leading them to a safer integration and leading to more positive outcomes, of course. And something that isn't mentioned all too often is that research can help inform well-being practitioners, such as yoga meditation teachers, on how to best hold individuals who are having these experiences in their classrooms. And this is something that I was deeply disappointed in when I undertook my yoga teacher training a year or so after my experience. There was no mention of what might happen in the classroom, or what might happen to yourself if, as a yoga teacher, if you open up if you access that kind of unlimited potential, have a Kundalini experience. What do you do in those situations? And I think the more we research these experiences, the better we'll be able to inform well-being practitioners on how to safely deal with the unfolding of these experiences, and ultimately on how to raise the potential and unlock it and help people through them. And research will also help us better understand the most effective practices for opening up these sort of energetic experiences, because I believe that altered states are a human right. And I think that as long as you're well informed on the pros and the cons of these experiences, or the positive and the negative experiences that might emerge from them, I think it's within everyone's right to have these experiences, or to work within these realms. And in a less scientific way, how can we change things? Again, by sharing our own experience, I believe that speaking out loud and engaging with individuals, even if you think they won't understand, is really can be deeply transformative for our humanity, and can really support the paradigm shift that I think is happening at the moment. So sharing our own experience breaks the taboo, of course. It destigmatizes and validates experiences, and it encourages individuals to come out of their own spiritual closet. If you are able to set up communities as well, where you can speak about these experiences openly, share resources. Obviously, things like Spiritual Awakenings International are incredible, because they run, I believe, monthly spiritual awakening sharing circles and peer support groups, and that is quintessential for individuals' well-being, particularly when you want to reconnect with the element of earth. Something that we forget is that the element of earth is also very much in contact with a community feeling, with engaging with other human beings, with the social element of humanity. So if you're able to set up communities and spread information and share information. And that brings me on to my next point, sharing and publishing open access research, which I've already mentioned with regards to scientific research. And I've also already mentioned a connection and the importance of connecting with indigenous and traditional ways of knowing for a more rounded approach, a more holistic approach to understanding these experiences. And I believe that learning about these experiences, sharing these experiences, talking about these experiences will help raise a frequency of this earth, and not in any esoteric way, but it will help individuals understand that these experiences are possible within the realm of their own reality. And so we'll be sparking interest in spiritual growth, and we're already seeing this shift worldwide. And this in itself will unlock human potential and the human qualities that are so desperately needed in today's world, such as empathy, gratitude, and love. And this is where I feel that a return to wholeness is possible. And let's all try and engage in a more compassionate, understanding and united world for the betterment of humanity, for the betterment of ourselves, by engaging in these sorts of practices, but also by being informed and by sharing information on them. And that's a list of resources that I'd like to share with you all if you're having a difficult experience, or if you just want to engage with like-minded people, or you're having a positive experience, but you need to find some sort of guidance, then please consult these resources, including Spiritual Awakenings International, of course, Assist, and so on and so forth. I will post these links. There's probably a follow-up email, so I'll send those over. And thank you so much for listening. If you want to contact me, please get in touch at my email address, which is right here. And for my publication, you can find it here. And a book that we recently published with the Galileo Commission, then please consult this link on the bottom. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm opening the floor for questions now.
Okay, if I can get you to stop screen sharing there, Jessica, please. Awesome. Thank you for a really wonderful and very deep presentation about your experience and your research. Our board member of Spiritual Awakenings International, Ann Archer, will be moderating the question and answer period. So welcome, Ann. And I would invite everybody to put your questions into the chat so that Ann can ask them to Jessica. Go ahead, please, Ann.
Jessica, that was beautiful. Thank you. I had anticipated your presentation with excitement, and it left me full of rich knowledge. I really appreciated your research. And of course, it left us with some questions as well. So let's dive into those if you don't mind. How long ago was your experience, Jessica?
It was about 6.5 years ago now, almost 7 years, which is crazy because time flies. It was on the 20th of February, 2016. I remember it, the exact day. Yeah.
During that time, how would you say overall your life has evolved? Because let's look at it as an evolutionary experience, and what has it brought into belief for you in the physical world? What's happened?
I became a lot more understanding of the human condition, which was both a blessing and a curse, I think, because I feel so much more empathy for individuals, even those that are considered bad. Because what my experience taught me is that the fundamentals of this universal consciousness or cosmic consciousness is a deep benevolence. And And that understanding that I experienced at the time just stayed with me. This understanding that we are all perfect, we are all good inherently. We've just lost the way sometimes, or some of us have lost the way completely. So that's how one really, really strong way that it changed me. It also, interestingly, propelled me into the direction of science. I was very non-scientific before, non-academic. I was working as I was working in the arts, and I was an aspiring art curator. So it transformed my life in that way as well. But it also helped me to be a lot more in the present. It allowed me to overcome a lot more, many more difficulties in my life, because of course I didn't stop having difficulties after that experience. But the way I like to describe it to people is that whereas before my experience, I was on an up and down like this, after my experience, I was on an up and down up here. But again, the lows were never that low. But I was operating from I am still operating from a completely different kind of space, where I'm able to gain better perspective of my life and of the challenges that I might be faced with. But it's changed me in so many ways. It's almost impossible to describe in how many ways it has, because it's unlimited.
Beautiful. Thank you. I have another question for you. This one's been posted a couple of times, but I just want to go to the end of the question and let's look at that. Have you recognized a difference between the spontaneous spiritual awakening that you had, or spontaneous spiritual awakenings you've researched, and spiritual enlightenment that has been experienced by true spiritual masters, a progressive spiritual enlightenment? And could you address that?
That's a really good question. I would challenge the word great spiritual master. Of course, some people have been able to put the word across to, millions, i.e., if Jesus Christ existed, which he may have, he was a great leader in that sense, or the Buddha. But I believe, from what I've read, and from the experiences that I've heard from my participants, from the individuals that I've engaged with since, from my own experience, that the key elements, those of self-transcendence, of ego dissolution, of connection, of oneness, of deep love, they're similar. They're very similar to those that are described by the great spiritual masters. So I don't see a real difference there. But I also haven't studied the great spiritual masters versus my participants or my own experience. But I read a lot and I haven't noticed that many differences. The only difference that seems prominent is that great spiritual masters seem to be able to remain on that plane for a much longer period of time, perhaps even indefinitely. So I think that's what true enlightenment might be, or might be described as. But glimpses of enlightenment are possible, or even extended periods of enlightenment are possible, in my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. I do have a request here. Do you have a web page? I cannot recall if you said you have a web page or not. And if you do, oh, yes, you don't yet. Okay, so hey, people, you actually have her email address, so that's even better. Go there. Let's say, I'm wondering about this question. Have you continued to have spiritually transformative experiences over the past 6 years? And has it been triggering to pursue the advanced degree and conduct research on the topic?
Yeah. So I'll address the second question first. Has it been triggering? No one's ever asked me that. And yes, it has, because whilst I know this is something that I really want to do and I'm very excited about, and it's become my passion and my obsession, it has sometimes overcast my own inner experience, because I've been so in my mind at times about what these experiences mean, and so on and so forth. But I've now managed to find a balance between the two. So yes, researching the experience has been triggering for me at times. But again, I've found a way of integrating both. And it's good to be triggered sometimes because it just helps you evolve and grow further. And the first question was, could you repeat the first question again, please?
Yes. Have you continued to have spontaneous spiritual experiences or spiritually transformative experiences over the past 6 years?
Yes, perfect. I have. So nothing as strong as the first experience, because that was absolutely flabbergasting, but I have had a number of different spiritually transformative experiences since the experience. One which really changed, again, the direction of my way of thinking and my way of engaging with the topic was a more negative experience that I had a couple of years after the positive one. I think it was actually 3 years after. I was on a retreat and I had already done my yoga teacher training. So I knew about different yogic postures and different breathing exercises. And on this retreat, I was feeling a little bit cocky. And I was like, okay, I am going to apply Mahabandha, which is an application of all of the body locks, the Jalanda band, the throat lock, the diaphragm, and the Mula Bandha, which is the anus, sex organs, belly to backbone. So there are ways in yoga in which you can consolidate energy and move it upwards. And I decided that I would engage in this bandha, this lock, this body lock, because I wanted to feel this spiritual ecstasy again whilst I was on this retreat. And this bandha was not advised. I was advised against practicing it. We were all advised against practicing it in our yoga teacher trainings because they said it was too powerful and that it would unleash Kundalini too quickly. But I was feeling very confident and I did it, and it resulted in a very difficult experience. Again, in hindsight, it's a very positive experience because it helped me understand that spiritual experiences can be negative, but it was very, very challenging at the time. I had malfunctions of I basically purged, I vomited, and I felt really, really panicky and I couldn't bring myself down. I was so ungrounded, I didn't know what to do. And I wasn't at home, so I was feeling even more ungrounded and even less in contact with my normal reality. And that lasted only a few hours, but it really shook me to the core. And it almost felt as though something, and I don't want to say an entity because I don't feel like there was an entity necessarily, but there was this feeling of you went too far and you messed with it. And so, yes, that was something that was quite significant on my journey. But again, I'm over that as well. And it only ever enriched my life. Yeah.
Another question, have you noticed that people can open themselves to either positive or negative spiritual experiences, and what might cause that?
I'm actually working with the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium at the moment. We're writing a paper on this very topic, looking at what might be more conducive to positive experiences versus what might be more conducive to negative experiences. But we don't really know because there isn't enough research out there on the topic. So we don't really know, but there's obviously, I'm sure Yvonne probably has an opinion on this as well. And it would be interesting to get Yvonne's take maybe later or now. But yeah.
Well, this is your time, Jessica. So I'll leave my response to later on.
Spiritual Awakenings International does deal with this topic and many others, and I appreciate you acknowledging this organization for the work that they are doing. But let's move into another question too. You mentioned that these experiences seem to be increasing and that you expect them to continue to increase, which Spiritual Awakenings International totally agrees with, that there's an evolution that is occurring and perhaps rapidly occurring. Do you believe that the world is entering a new age of spiritual awakening, Jessica?
Age of Aquarius. No, I mean, personally, this was a feeling that I experienced that, yes, we are going through a paradigm shift. But if I'm to just ground myself and speak maybe in a more rational way, I think it's obvious that we are anyway, because like I said, people are engaging in spiritual contemplative practices more frequently. There's more access to these topics through books and also through research now more and more. People are there's an increase in psychedelic use around the globe. So yes, I mean, it would make absolute sense, even from a more rational perspective, that things are changing and that we are evolving in a specific direction. And I do believe that more and more people will have these experiences.
Very good. Another thing I noticed in your speaking was that you skipped a particular bullet point that you had listed. It said reduced anxiety. As one of the effects and of having this kind of spiritual experience. Can you go ahead and address that for us, please?
Yes, please. That's great. I just missed it. So there seems to be a reduction in anxiety, particularly towards fear of death, but just general. So from my own personal experience, for example, I had really bad anxiety prior to my experience. And then when I had my experience, I was freed of all of that panic and anxiety that I had felt previously. And this is something that's recurring. We've addressed it scientifically through surveys, but also just the more you speak to people, the more you realize this is a real recurring sort of thing, that there is a reduction of anxiety following the experience, or that tends to be. But yes, there's also a reduction in anxiety towards death, which is odd because they're not necessarily induced through near-death experiences. But this is also something that I really strongly felt. I felt that I had come home. It felt like a homecoming, and it felt like that was the same space, mental, physical, spiritual, that when you die, you access in a much bigger way. So that's where the reduction of anxiety, I think, comes from, towards fear of death.
Excellent. And that reduction of anxiety has continued for you, correct? Because many people in the world today are experiencing tremendous anxiety, and they list it as one of their most difficult things to deal with. So I think it bears repeating, please.
Yeah. I still suffer from some anxiety, I don't want to lie, but it's not at all on the same level as before. It's not that it was debilitating before, but it was very prominent in my life. Now I'm able to sort of look at it and go, okay, that's anxiety, and just sort of move on from it, which I think helps a great deal in overcoming things, just to acknowledge and to move on. And I think something to say with regards to spiritual awakenings is that you need to maintain that level as well. You can't expect to be like that forever. It feels like you will be like that forever, but eventually that altered state kind of starts to wane and integrate into the everyday fabric of existence. And so I think it's important to maintain that state of peace, of equanimity, of reduced stress and anxiety by, engaging in specific practices, by ridding ourselves of things that we no longer need in our lives, including stressors. I think we need to continue doing our homework, basically, and we are not exempt from things like anxiety and stress.
Excellent. We'll go back to that question in a moment, but I want to ask you this based on one of our participants. Have you had backlash from friends and family, or are they broadly supportive of you?
I'm very, very lucky. I was extremely held by my family, but I only told 2 members of my family at the time, my partner and my mum. First of all, that was because I didn't feel the need to tell that many people, because I didn't need the validation. But I also knew that they would understand. My partner had a very profound psilocybin experience when he was a lot younger, which sort of changed his life. And my mum has always been rather spiritual, let's say, not in an overt, outward sort of spirituality way, but she's always had that connection with nature and with spirit in many ways. So I knew that I could talk to them about it, even if they couldn't understand the exact experience, but they could empathize and listen at least. So no, it was very well received. And then with my friends, I remember a few months after my experience, I went back to London. I was still in this state of bliss and joy, and nothing could touch me basically. And I just told my friends, like, I am so happy. Essentially, that's what I was. And so they didn't really know that I was having this spiritual experience. I tried to explain it to them, but never in the right context. I don't think they fully understood, because I wasn't acting irrationally or maniacally. It wasn't that. It was obvious in the sense that I was very happy, but it wasn't obvious in other ways. But yeah, overall, very well received so far.
Now, as an extension of that question, have you had backlash in the academic community or skeptics in the academic world to your research or to your experience or to your viewpoints?
Luckily, not yet. I'm very surprised that I haven't received a nasty email yet. But luckily not yet, actually. And I think that comes from just explaining explicitly what you mean on the scientific paper, to not assume that everybody understands the language that you're speaking with, but to actually describe things and be explicit with the words that you use, such as what do we mean by spontaneous spiritual awakenings? And also to not claim to have any answers, but to just put the information out there. You can't reject subjective experience. And so, yeah.
And are there specific things that you believe help people to have these experiences? Because, the granddaddy of them all is a near-death experience. And in Spiritual Awakenings International, many of us have had those experiences, but certainly don't want to advocate having the near-death experience in order to have any form of greater awareness. So what do you believe is the most fundamental ways that people can have more spontaneous spiritual experiences and open themselves to this awareness?
Well, things like any activity that brings out a greater sense of absorption, i.e. through drumming or trance states induced by meditation, mantra chanting, those can potentially induce spiritual awakenings or mystical experiences. But also contact with nature, since it was a report, one of the most reported preceding factors to the experience. It kind of makes me think that if you get in touch with nature, you might the inverse might be true. If you go out in nature, you might be more likely to experience a spiritual awakening. So yes, so anything that gets you into a trance state, i.e. mantra meditation, chanting, repetition, drumming, even dancing, anything that gets you into that ecstatic space, contact with nature, and psychedelics seem to be quite effective in inducing these kinds of experiences. But again, they wouldn't be spontaneous; they would be induced. And also, there are dangers with taking psychedelics as well. So we need to be careful with all of these things, I think.
So let's move forward with a final question. In your own life, because this was a dream experience that came on, have you been able to analyze what led you to have such a lucid and inspiring experience spontaneously yourself?
Am I able to pinpoint why I had the experience?
Yes. Did you analyze that?
No, I mean, initially I wondered, is it because I had lots of tryptophan-rich foods? But no, there's literally no reason why I would have had such a profound experience. I mean, of course, I believe that in life, everything leads to an event, right? Your whole past leads you to specific events, to every event, in fact. So you can't remove an experience from the rest of life. But in terms of something that I can actually pinpoint to have caused the experience, I don't know.
Very good. Thank you. And, many people have asked for your email address again. Can you just give it to us verbally, please, Jessica?
I can write it here in the chat box, actually.
Lovely. Thank you. And thanks so much for the answers to your questions. There were many more, but our time has run out now. And thank you, Jessica, for your presentation. It was enlightening. It was exciting. And we love the research you're doing and want to encourage you in all of your work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Yvonne and Robert, and everybody else.
Thank you, Jessica. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. Thank you so very, very, very much.